Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. Immigrants to the United States often come with a religious identity that is non-Western. Now, while the U.S. has always valued religious pluralism, do we really want to welcome these new perspectives? Our guest today will tell us why immigration and religious pluralism are positive forces for America. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Jose Casanova, Chair and Professor of Sociology at the New School for Social Research in New York City. His research concentrations include religion, democratization, transnational migration, and social change in Latin America, Europe, and the U.S. Welcome, Jose.
Thank you very much for having me here.
You know, migration has changed considerably for the U.S. since the 1920s, where we had, a large rush of immigration and then a change. What caused that change?
Well, in the 1920s, there was a very clear anti-immigration sentiment grew, and so you have very draconian anti-immigration laws that basically close the borders for immigration.
Was this after World War I?
It was after World War I, and it was a resistance to the new direction. I mean, the new immigrants were coming from Southern Europe, from the Eastern Europe, and so they were not as desirable as the old Western and Northern European immigrants.
Okay, so as long as they sort of looked like the majority people who are already here, but as they became different in some ways, we became more uncomfortable.
Right.
So what happened in 1965?
Well, there was a new immigration law that basically opened the gates again.
And why was that? Why in 65?
Well, actually, interesting enough, it was an attempt on the part of some of the old European immigrants to open the gates again for Europeans, especially Italian, Irish, Greeks, and the idea was to have quotas for Latin American immigrants. But actually what happened was it opened the gates for Latin American immigrants and for Asian immigrants, especially the Chinese, who had remained mainly male Chinese without access to their families.
Okay, so we had a large Chinese immigration, but not with their families.
Right, because there had been resistance to letting all entire families come in.
And it has been successful.
I would say very much so,
right.
Especially the most important thing is that it has diversified immigration. Before it was primarily European. There were some groups, as you mentioned, the Chinese, but now it's really from all over the world, Latin America, the Caribbean, all over Asia, Africa.
And this fits with our image as the melting pot.
Yes, the melting pot, but before it was a melting pot of European nations, now it's a melting pot of all societies of the world.
So the stew was a little more limited the first time around, and now it's
much more complicated.
Very much more
complicated. Yes.
Now, most immigrants come, according to the research, with a religious perspective.
This is a very interesting phenomenon. Not only they come with a religious perspective, but they become more religious here than they were in the home country.
More religious here.
Right. This was something that was already observed before. That people, the Jews became more Jews here than they had been in Europe.
Right.
And the Catholics became more Catholics here. Italian immigrants from, let's say, southern Italy, going to Milan, to Turin, or to Argentina, and they became anarchist socialists, abandoned their religion.
Okay.
They came to the large urban centers in the United States, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Boston, and they became more Catholic here than they were in Italy.
So you could do studies where, we'll just take a small number, we'll take 1,000 immigrants, they go to the capitals of the world, but the capitals in America produce more religious immigrants than the capitals, like you said, in Argentina or Milan.
Right, and we see the same development now. If you compare, let's say, Senegalese immigrants to Paris, they are Francophone, or Senegalese to New York. They are much more organized as a religious group, let's say, in Harlem, than they are in Paris.
So what is it about America that helps immigrants deep in their faith, if we put it that way?
Well, this has always been a very religious country,
Yes.
so when in Rome, do as the Romans,
Okay,
right?
so it's an assimilation issue.
But it's not only that, it has also to do with the fact that from the very beginning, pluralism in the United States was organized through denominational pluralism. First only among Protestants, but the very variety and diversity of denominational groups.
Okay, let's talk about that. You said denominational pluralism.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
By that I mean the traditional model in Europe was you have a national church and then you have religious minorities, church and sect.
Okay, so an Anglican church, a Lutheran church, something like that.
But at the time of independence, you had at least 3 churches in America. The
That's
Congregational Church in New England, the
Right.
Presbyterian Church in the Mid-Atlantic states, the Anglican Church in the South. So none of them could become the church of the United States.
That's right.
When you have 3 churches competing, and then when the other minorities, the Methodists and the Baptists, they were tiny minorities at the time of independence, but by the 1820s were larger already than the old churches. Then you have so many churches competing that they are not anymore church and sect, but they become all equal denominations.
That's right.
And this is the model.
Yes. Okay. So denominations had some equality between each other,
Right.
and had some respect between each other. All still Protestant, however.
Right. Based on the principle and the voluntary principle of the sect, which is maybe an association of voluntary members.
Okay.
And this principle of the sect was transferred to all religious groups in the United States. And first, when the Catholic immigrants came, there had always been small Catholic minorities, already in Baltimore, of course, and at the time of independence. But really massive Catholic immigration began in the 1830s and 1840s from Ireland, and then obviously from Germany and other parts of
But that was somewhat suspect.
At first, because this was defined as a Christian nation, and Christian meant Protestant, and there was an old tradition of anti-poppies kind of sentiments.
That could you be Catholic and still be a nationalist for the United States?
And there was a whole literature on the incompatibility between republicanism and Romanism.
Mormonism meaning
Romanism
Catholic.
in Rome, Roman
Yeah.
Catholic, and the idea again was those Catholics cannot be full loyal citizens because they owe allegiance to Rome.
Well, that was the whole thing with President Kennedy,
Exactly.
right? The
Right,
whole,
exactly.
was he going to take his orders from the people, or was he going to take his orders from the Pope?
Right, so it took almost, I would say, about 80 years, several generations, for the Catholics to be accepted as an American denomination.
Yes.
And the same goes with the Jews. So this was an expansion of American denominationalism to include Judaism and Catholicism as truly American religions. Not as foreign religions in America, but truly as American religions.
Right.
And this is what precisely the literature of the 60s celebrated, this kind of a civil religion that incorporates Protestants, Catholics, and Jews.
So in the 60s, they were celebrating this.
Will Herberg wrote this famous book, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, explaining how the process of immigration, these religious identities had been very important.
Okay.
Then came the theory of civil religion that was developed by Robert Bella precisely after the inaugural presidential speech of President Kennedy.
What do you mean by civil religion?
Civil religion has an old history as a concept, but what Bella meant was the notion of a common kind of religious identity which is not formalized into dogma or principles, but the acceptance from one nation under God.
Okay.
The kind of religious symbols that we have as a nation.
It's a self-image issue.
It's a self-image, but also the kind, I mean, he uses, what he does is he uses the inaugural speeches by presidents from Jackson on to show how there is mention of this kind of national religious unity, God. It has no denominational name. It's a God.
and that still happens today,
Right,
all the
exactly,
time.
exactly,
Right. We have a
exactly.
national
Right.
tragedy, and
Right.
we call on the name of God to help us in these times of grief.
Right. And what happened then, the discourse of a Christian nation that meant Protestant then turned into a Judeo-Christian nation.
That's right.
That included Jews and Catholics. And now we were in the process, until very recently, of beginning to talk of an Abrahamic nation.
Now that's new to me, Abrahamic nation. Where is that being written?
Well,
and
it
talked about?
was before September 11 in the 90s. People, religious leaders, and the fact that already you could say symbolically you have the incorporation of Muslim imams.
Yes.
You have in Washington, in the state capitals, in large cities, you have public celebrations where you have a Protestant minister, a Catholic priest, a Jewish rabbi, and then an imam, a Muslim imam. in New Jersey, or in the year 2000, you have the beginning of the legislature, the month of Ramadan, the reading of the Quran in the state legislature.
Now, this is fairly new, though, isn't it?
This was new because only in the 90s Islam became visible as a public religion. That was had before the Nation of Islam, as black Africans or African Americans converted to Islam.
Yeah, that's right. The Nation of Islam is our most visible symbol of that, right?
Right. But now with the new immigrants coming in, there was also the beginning of Muslim chaplains in the army. The army, as usual, it is the institution that always plays in incorporating all the immigrants.
Right.
So they began the incorporation, probably the celebration of Ramadan.
And food, dietary changes, correct, in the military?
And then the White House inviting again Muslim leaders at the end of Ramadan to have a meal at the White House.
Are there countries outside of the United States where the Muslim religion has assimilated into both sort of a nationalized acceptance and a retaining of their own orthodoxy?
Well, I would say that actually this process may be more advanced in the United States, although the immigration is more recent, than in Europe, where it's an older immigration, but this is the interesting thing after September 11.
Right.
Well, in Europe especially led to a very critical reaction against Muslim immigrants. In the United States, it made them visible, but also led to processes of kind of a nationalization, the formation of Muslim local communities. Before, you had Muslim communities at the local level that were relatively well integrated, but you had no national organization.
That's right.
So now you have the formation of national organization of Muslims associations, modeled after the Jewish organizations.
Yeah, but why? Is it because they feel that they need to be able to speak with more one voice?
It is partly to precisely respond to the accusations.
Right.
In the same way that the Jews organize the Anti-Defamation League, so the Muslims, the Catholics also have an Anti-Defamation League, and the Muslims. So to tell their story.
Well, to counteract the discrimination.
Also,
you're right.
Of course,
I mean, there is some suspicion, perhaps,
right.
Just like with the early Catholics, etc., that and Jewish persons not being admitted to certain groups. So it's effective. They hope to be effective.
Right. And of course there are tensions, although I would say there was no anti-Muslim religious discourse probably until the late 90s. But then it begins. You have now some anti-Muslim discourse among religious leaders, especially Protestant evangelical leaders. And you can see, although the White House tried to differentiate between the war on terror and
our own citizens, correct?
And it has nothing to do against Islam. We respect Muslim religious people. But there were some statements from leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson that were more clearly directed at Islam as a religion, as being an un-American religion linked to violence.
But and that certainly has been countered by more moderate national leaders.
Right. But there was also literature, not unlike the old literature defaming Catholic traditions. You have in some Christian bookstores books written by Muslims converted to Christianity that defame the old religion. But again, I would say those are minimal things compared with what I would say is a much more negative anti-Muslim reaction throughout Europe.
Yes, because you have, of course, in London, in Britain, they are having more difficulties with an assimilation process. And of course in France you see the difficulties with assimilation. And in a country like Nigeria you have Christians versus Muslims at very big tensions that exist. Why are the tensions in those countries larger than what we think the tensions are here?
Well, I think it has to do because there are smaller groups here, and as I said, it's a much more diverse communities. They come from all over the Muslim world. They are not easily visible as one single group, and they also are socioeconomically are relatively well integrated.
Okay,
Many
so
of them
they're
professionals,
educated, yes.
Exactly, so they can present their position better, and they do not present a social problem of integration.
Right.
So it's only a symbolic problem of incorporating Islam as a religion.
So our value in America is respect and tolerance and assimilation. As long as the immigrant group is willing to take on this sort of what are the American values.
Right, but there's an interesting comment which already Will Herberg made, that while immigrants were expected to abandon many of their identities and customs and language they brought from their old country, they were not supposed to abandon their religion. On the contrary,
yes, that's right.
It was through their religious identity that they, or more importantly, their children became incorporated, integrated in American society.
Because it's very important to be an American with a religious faith.
And so this religious faith allows the immigrants to be different, to maintain identity, but also to be American. The more religious they are, the more American they prove to be.
Okay.
And so we have even, I mean, symbolically, for instance, Soviet Jews, who are not very religious, because they grew up in the Soviet Union with Jewishness being an ethnic national identity, not a religious one. But they come here and you see how the longer they are here, almost year by year, the more they identify Judaism as a religion, not as an ethnic identity. And they begin to identify with also Jewish congregations and join Jewish congregations.
But isn't that sort of group dynamic theory, which is if you have a large group, you need to break down into a smaller unit, both for socialization, friendship, help in crisis. So now just take it on a huge scale. You take 300 million people, and you have to find a group on which to belong, right? And to get help or to, again, have friendship or community or entrance or networking. So do the churches function that way?
Well, partly this is the interesting question about America. There have been two main keys to organize this group pluralism, this group dynamics. And those have been religious and race.
Religious and race? Yes, right.
So it is racial grouping and religious denominations are the two main ways of structuring group pluralism in American society.
Is one more positive or negative?
Well, I would say the religious pluralism, because denominationalism precisely presupposes equality among denominations and freedom of religion and non-hierarchy. So ideally, you could also have a multiracial society in which all races are equal. But we know, of course, from the history that racism has built into it a kind of unequal hierarchies. So in this respect, religious pluralism offers to many of the new immigrants, which precisely are racially suspicious or suspect because of their dark skin.
So religion is actually a great equalizer in the United States.
To a certain extent, indeed. And you know, Hindus will tell you better Hindu than brown, right? And so the Haitians will emphasize their Catholic Creole identity rather than their black skin, and so on. So there is an attempt for religious groups to identify their religious identity over their racial characteristics.
So do you think in the Muslim religion we will see a gradual unification of some of the different groups? So you have, let's just take African American Islamic practice and Arab American Islamic practice. Do you see any chance that they will blend?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and probably one question that will have, I would say, very tremendous
potential
of great relevance for certainly for race relations in American society. We don't know which type of denominational structure American Islam is going to have, whether it will, like the Catholic Church, a national ummah, whether it will be divided like Protestantism into so many denominations on the basis of ethnic origin, theological differences, ecclesiastical organization, or like the Jewish, three main denominations, the Orthodox, the Conservative, and the Reform, which basically are theological differences. We see some. Originally, most of the mosques are organized along ethnic, national origin.
Ethnic, but not theology.
Not theology, but now you have the beginnings of mixture, and you have an attempt to create all Muslim mosques, which are not ethnic.
Well, especially perhaps in small towns.
Well, in small towns they have to, because there are so few of them. Only when you have large numbers of Muslims in New York, you have all kinds of mosques. Some of them ethnically based, other more in terms of Sunni Shia differences. But one of the interesting questions is whether Muslims will be able to bring, especially African American Muslims, and immigrant Muslims.
Now you have so many different customs that are actually visibly apparent to Nation of Islam. Have the bow tie or the suit. I don't know about the head coverings for women for that. And of course you don't have the full coverings for women for the Nation of Islam. Will those be forever sort of differentiating factors?
Well, I assume that there will be differences the same way you have among the Jewish congregations or synagogues, three fundamentally different movements, a conservative one, an Orthodox one, a conservative one, and a Reform liberal one. You may have such differences among Muslims. But here the interesting question is whether Islam in America will be able to overcome the racial segregation which has plagued American Christianity.
Yes.
And if they are able to do that and bring together all the races into their Muslim communities, then I think we'll have a very positive effect on the structuring of racial relations in America.
Understanding why religions, even the ones that are the same name, continue to split around racial lines is a complex question. And sometimes people feel, if the small group is the group that they are feeling comfortable and assimilated with, that they'd actually prefer to be with persons whose customs are similar to theirs. And it may or may not have to do with an unequal look at race.
Well,
what do you think about that?
Once, if there is equality, and of course people may feel more comfortable with their own group, and of course it's also the fact that for African Americans, the black churches were the only place where they could establish their own autonomous organization, their leadership. So it was a very positive institution, despite precisely the segregation, precisely because it allowed them to develop some kind of self-organization, which was very important for all the leadership of the African American community. So in this respect, I assume that there is an element precisely of group dynamics that will lead to different kinds of congregations.
Right.
Yes.
Do you think that then immigration is actually a positive force for the United States as a whole country?
Well,
if we are
certainly
religious people,
in socioeconomic grounds, I would say yes. I think it has given a dynamism to America. I mean, it brings, precisely because while half of the immigrants may be lower class and they do the menial jobs then other Americans don't want to do, half of all immigrants have higher levels of education and income than the average American. In this respect, it brings the best from all over the world. Dynamic people, many of them came as students, stay as professionals, but also many of them come as professionals because they see more opportunities here than they have in their own country. Particularly with Asian immigrants, Indian, Chinese, very clear that those are relatively upper middle class immigrants that bring skills and entrepreneurial and professional skills.
But what do you think about the fear that if America is considered by some people religious but yet Christian, and you have this pluralism now coming in, that may be where the tension point will come if we can't understand ourselves as not just Christian, but as religious.
But that's why the incorporation of Catholics and Jews is so important, because it was difficult. It was not that simple. But once accomplished, it expanded what I meant by the American civil religion to incorporate these other religions. And I think there is a process, for instance, there was no anti-Muslim discourse, but there was an anti-Hindu discourse, because they said those people are polytheists, those are cow worshippers in the worst possible sense.
That's correct.
And therefore they cannot be an American religion. And yet then you have the response of the Hindus, no, you don't understand our religion. We also have a principle of a universal principle, which is a kind of unifying principle, divinity. And so there is a kind of, in this attack, critique, and response, you have a dynamic of integration, an attempt by all immigrant religions to present themselves as loyal American religions that fit very well the model.
But what do you think that when you tend to have the acceptance of all, you get sort of a watered down sense of orthodoxy, faith, religion?
Well, if there will be such a thing as non-denominational denominations.
Non-denominational denominations?
And there are some non-denominational congregations, namely those which are purely Christian.
Yes.
I mean, before the competition was, let's say, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian.
Yes, now non-denominational
congregations, right? But you don't have, and you have, of course, those kind of Unitarians or ethical culture, which basically are those humanists that try to bring all religions together. But those are really minority phenomena. In general, what you find is people that affirm their identity, their differential identity, while accepting that other people have other identities. And they accept their God while accepting that some people may worship a different God. So in the same way that denomination presupposes equality of religions, then this principle is ingrained in the American principle that each has the right to worship their own God or to follow their conscience.
Yes, I think that is a very strong principle here.
And therefore you accept and you see people on the one hand maintaining their own faith, their own identity, while accepting people that have different faiths, different identities.
And don't you think it would actually be better at these interfaith groups to have strong, identified prayers and beliefs with their group versus a sort of dear great spirit kind of prayer for this reason. Right. If we can get to the point where we respect each person's desire and right to have a deep faith, right, then it would seem better to identify those deep faiths rather than getting kind of a superficial religiosity.
But that's why most of the time when the different denominations come together in public prayer, they don't come as these washi-washi, but they come actually as Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, and they pray, they use their sacred texts, which are different. So, yeah, you have an attempt to develop a kind of Esperanto religion that brings all religions together, right? I think that this is not the way, and very few religious people can accept this Esperanto religion.
No.
On the other hand, you can have precisely the many denominations which maintain their identity while accepting that other people have different identity.
That's right.
Right.
Thank you. My guest today has been Jose Casanova, sociology professor at the New School for Social Research in New York City. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.